All right, ready to dive into something new today? We're strapping on our curiosity shoes for this deep dive. We're talking orthotics. We'll be untying all the knots about how they work the magic, what they're made of, and what they can do for you. And to help us step right, we've got an expert joining us who can break down the science behind every stride. Now, our sources for this deep dive didn't hold back on the technical terms, did they? We're talking neutral position, subtalar joint congruency. Phew. Ever feel like your ankles need a translator?
Well, they might sound a little intimidating, but really those terms are just about finding that sweet spot for your feet.
Sweet spot. I like that. So neutral position, that's like, what, your foot's happy place, where everything's lined up and raring to go.
You got it. Think of it as the position where your foot is at its most stable and efficient. And that subtalar joint they mentioned, that's the one right below your ankle bone. Congruency just means those bones are fitting together nice and snug so everything moves smoothly.
Like a well-oiled machine. But what happens when those parts aren't meshing like they should? That's where orthotics step in.
Exactly. Orthotics help guide your foot back into that optimal position, that neutral position we talked about, and that can actually make a difference all the way up your legs.
It's all connected, right? Our sources mentioned that even knee pain in runners can be helped with orthotics, which I thought was really interesting.
It makes sense when you think about it. When your feet are properly supported, it takes stress off your other joints, including your knees.
It's like a chain reaction. Speaking of chains, our sources talked about how professionals figure out exactly what kind of support you need. It's not as simple as just grabbing a pair off the shelf, is it?
Not at all. There's a real science to it. They look at things like...
It's like getting a custom suit, but for your feet. Our sources mentioned they measure something called deviation of the calcaneal midline.
Which is a fancy way of saying
How much your heel tilts. And they also check how your forefoot's lining up.
those measurements, they're key. They tell us a lot about how your feet move, whether you might be prone to things like, overpronation, for example.
So we know they're measuring, but like, how do they actually make the orthotic? What are they even made of?
Well, that's where the magic happens. There are actually a ton of different materials, and they each have their own, personality. Okay, maybe not personality, but they each serve a different purpose. Our sources mentioned flexible, semi-rigid, and rigid. Those are the main categories.
So choosing the right wood for a project, almost. You wouldn't use balsa wood for something that needs to be super sturdy, right?
That's a great way to think about it. A flexible orthotic is going to be softer, more about cushioning and absorbing shock, great for, say, a basketball player who's jumping around a lot. But if you need more support, if you're a runner, for example, you probably want something a little more rigid.
Makes sense. So if you have flat feet and you overpronate, you might need a totally different material than someone with high arches.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of custom orthotics. They're tailored to your specific needs, not just your measurements, but your activity level, any foot conditions you might have.
Wow, it's really amazing how much goes into these things. I'm starting to feel like my feet are these complex machines that need the right kind of tune-up.
And just like with a car, you got to have the right tires too, right? Which brings us to the importance of your shoes.
Yes, the trusty sidekick. I love that our sources called them a diary of your running style. It's like they're constantly taking notes on how you move.
Isn't that cool? The wear patterns on your shoes can tell us so much. Like if you're constantly wearing down the inner edges of your soles, that's a classic sign of overpronation.
It's like those detective shows where they're analyzing footprints at a crime scene. Except in this case, it's the scene of your last run.
Exactly. And just like there are different types of footprints, there are different types of shoes. Some are designed for a specific gait, some for a specific foot type.
Right. Our sources talked about a bunch of things to look for: good heel support, a roomy toe box, a flexible midsole. But the one that I thought was really interesting was last shape.
The last is basically the mold that the shoe is built on.
Okay.
It can be straight or curved, and that shape influences how the shoe fits your foot, how it supports your arches.
So it's like if you're baking a cake, the last is the shape of your pan. And then the orthotic is
the frosting.
yes, okay, maybe not exactly, but you get the idea. They work together.
And just like you wouldn't put a round cake in a square pan, you don't want to put your foot in a shoe with the wrong last shape.
So we're talking about a real matchmaking game here, finding the perfect orthotic shoe combo for your feet.
That's a great way to put it. It's all about finding what works for you. And our sources really emphasize that it's not just about correcting existing problems. It's about preventing new ones from popping up.
Right, because who wants to be sidelined with foot pain?
Yeah.
Right. Prevention is key. One thing they mentioned that I thought was interesting was gait analysis.
Gait analysis is fascinating.
Yeah?
Basically, by analyzing how your foot hits the ground, how your weight shifts, even how your arms swing, we can learn a ton about your movement patterns.
It's like having a personal trainer, but for your feet.
Exactly. And you know what else our sources talked about that I thought was really interesting? Range of motion tests.
Right. They were saying that's a really important part of the whole assessment process.
It's so important to understand how your feet move, not just what they look like, but how flexible they are, how mobile your ankles are.
It's like my feet have a whole secret life I never knew about. It's like my feet have a whole secret life I never knew about.
And the more we understand about that secret life, the better. We can start to address those little issues before they become big ones.
Right? Like that's got to be the goal, right? Keep those feet happy.
Absolutely. Whether you're running marathons or just, running to catch the bus, it all starts with healthy movement.
Love it. So we've covered a lot of ground here, no pun intended, from the nitty-gritty of subtalar joint congruency all the way to picking the perfect pair of shoes. If you had to pick one big takeaway for our listeners, what would it be?
That's a tough one. I think for me, it's that idea that everything's connected. Your feet are literally your foundation, and understanding how they work, how to support them, that's crucial, not just for athletes, for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. And for our listeners who are ready to take that next step, pun intended this time, remember, knowledge is power. We've got links to all the research we talked about, plus some other cool resources over in the show notes. So go ahead, give your feet a little love, learn about them, support them, and keep them moving. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of orthotics. Until next time, happy trails.